Simplify 0.9i minus I and negative 2i times negative 7i. What are we doing with these i's? What do the i's stand for? Now let's hear Chloe's latest tips and tricks. She wants you to know that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. When you have I to the first power, it's equal to I. When you have I squared, it's equal to negative 1. When you have I cubed, it's equal to negative I. And when you have I to the fourth power, it's equal to 1. If you have an exponent on I that is greater than or equal to 5, follow these steps. First, take the exponent and divide it by 4. Then you're going to take the number to the left of the decimal point in the quotient and multiply it by 4. Then you're going to take the product and subtract it from the original exponent. And the difference is the new exponent on I. Now that we have Chloe's tips and tricks, we can go ahead and simplify both of these expressions. We know that when we take the square root of negative 1, we actually get I. Anytime you have a square root of a negative, you get an imaginary number, and that's what I stands for, as an imaginary number. When you are adding, subtracting, or multiplying these, what we're going to do is treat I as if it is a variable. So let's go ahead and look at this first one. We have 0.9i minus I. Now, there's actually a 1 in front of that I, we just don't write the 1. So we really have 0.9i minus 1i. If these were a variable like x, go ahead and just pretend it's an x, 0.9x minus x. So we would go ahead and subtract 0.9 minus 1, and we would get negative 0.1. So our answer to this first one is negative 0.1i. Now let's look at the negative 2i times negative 7i. Again, this one is very similar. We're going to treat I as if it is a variable. So when we are multiplying, we would take negative 2 times negative 7 and get a positive 14. And I times I would give us I squared. Now you can look over here, Chloe went ahead and showed us that I to the first is just the same thing as I. I is the square root of negative 1. When we have I squared, that would mean I times I, or square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. And when you are multiplying two like radicans, meaning they have the same index and the same radicand, you can just drop the radical sign and just keep the radicand. So I squared is negative 1. I cubed, that would be the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. Well, you know that the square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1, since they're like radicals, it's just negative 1, just the radicand. Then you have to multiply that by the square root of negative 1. Well, we know the square root of negative 1 is I, so negative 1 times I is a negative I. And I to the fourth is equal to 1. How do we get that? Because that would be the same as square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1. And since these first two are like radicands, we have the radical sign drop and we just keep the radicand of negative 1. Same thing with the third and fourth one, we get negative 1. And negative 1 times negative 1 is a positive 1. So Chloe has already showed us that I squared is actually equal to negative 1. So instead of 14i squared, we're going to plug in negative 1 for I squared. And 14 times negative 1 is equal to 14. Negative 14. And that is our final answer.